The reason I put this slide up is because the publication by Irene Elkin in 1989 led to a headline banner in the New York Times. The headline banner was, "Psychotherapy on par with antidepressant medication for the treatment of depression." And so this was a widespread media event, at least in the psychotherapy world, because at that time the notion that psychotherapeutic change could be enduring and touch a disorder that was seen as biologically determined as depression was considered very, very important. And these data continue to demonstrate that the prophylactic effects of acute phase treatment could sustain patients in recovery on par with what antidepressants were able to do for them. So these kinds of findings from RCTs help to buttress psychotherapy's ongoing confrontation or debate with more biologically oriented views of mental disorders. The other realm of support for the credibility of psychotherapy, and this is also a study that has a U of T psychiatry connection, comes from studies showing neural changes in brain regions that underlie affect regulation and that are moved around exclusively with psychotherapy. So these are unmedicated patients diagnosed with major depression. Helen Mayberg and I had a wonderful collaboration while she was here and conducted the first PET study of cognitive therapy in patients and showed that different regions through network analyses were impinging on the same area that was associated with treatment response, which was the subgenual cingulate. But from cognitive therapy, the communication with the subgenual cingulate was coming from more higher order cognitive and attentional centers, whereas with antidepressants, they were affecting the change in Brodmann area 24-25 through limbic and other areas. And so I found this incredibly helpful, especially in therapy when patients would ask how therapy could address a problem that was essentially resulting from a neurochemical deficiency and therefore ought to be treated by supplementing or bringing back up to some baseline level their neurochemicals through Prozac or an SSRI. The idea that one could say, yes, that's true, but psychotherapy has also been shown to have neuroplastic changes, allowed that conversation to become less dichotomous, and that different types of interventions could achieve meaningful outcomes, both in the brain and also experientially. And psychotherapy continues to appeal to the popular psyche with its own headline page in the New York Times devoted to issues of psychotherapy. So I don't know how many of you have seen this, but this is called Couch. People can write in, talk about psychotherapy experiences from the point of view of being a patient, point of view of being a therapist, point of view of just being involved in the world of psychotherapy and its ideas. And as you know, the New York Times gets a very, very wide readership. And this sort of public sanction of psychotherapy continues, very actively to this day. Community surveys indicate that there is a need among people with a mental health concern for psychotherapy. That when they're asked which of these different types of care pathways they would like to have, most people identify that psychotherapy is the one that's most missing for them, over information or over medication, whether they have mental or substance abuse, mood or anxiety disorder, any substance abuse or combined. People are often reaching for counseling or psychotherapy as the modality which is missing in the type of care that they can access. So the stage is set for a continued and sustained need for psychotherapy. And I feel that I may be able to provide some perspective, having been in the field, if you will, since 1983. In 1983, the only way you could access journals was by going to the Clark Institute Library and looking at the hard copy. There was no email, and since then, the whole thing sort of changed, and along with it, perhaps some of our attitudes and some of the ways that psychotherapy is being represented more broadly. So one of the changes that has been signaled comes from large-scale service surveys, and this one you may be familiar with. It was in the, I think it was in the American Journal by Olson and Marcus, showing that there is a trend for the decreased use of psychotherapy to treat mood disorders, bipolar disorder, an increase in the trend to use medication only for the treatment of these disorders, and a reduction in combined treatments. So what you see here are reductions in psychotherapy used to treat depression, increases in medication, a tenfold increase and small decrease, but also a decrease in combined treatments. Same here, almost a 20% increase for bipolar disorder and as well for anxiety disorders. So I think these slides suggest that complacency is probably not a great option, not a great strategy at this point in time, even given that our credibility is hovering quite high, and that there are a number of different trends that we ought to consider. The first trend is that with psychotherapy, there seems to be an increasing emergence of reduced modality distinctiveness. Now, when I came to the Clark Institute, if I can still use that, it was really hard to buy a hot dog at the cafeteria without running into someone like Jim Davey, who would make a phallic interpretation of what you're going to have. And it was wonderful, because it sort of knocked me out of my mindset of cognitive therapy certainty and reminded me that there are lots of people who think about the world very differently. and not just that, you could go back to the convention programs and see that there were a lot of debates and workshops and panels and symposia where cognitive therapists and dynamic therapists and others are speaking to each other about this essential question: how do the therapies developed by these three people and others differ? And are they better? And what's missing? And too much emphasis here, not enough emphasis here. You're missing this aspect, you're missing that aspect. And so there was a richness, there may have been a cacophony, but there was certainly an engagement of people who had affiliations with certain models. And I think that those affiliations allowed a professional identity to germinate that allowed people to enter into psychotherapy through a specific modality door. And perhaps what they found at some point is that it's really eclecticism that's important, because very few patients represent the monolithic type of patient that you might find reading about in a book, or that you might find reading about in case history. But they were recruited, they identified, and they were able to talk about their models. And I think some of this is actually becoming flattened. If you look at some of the meta-analyses in terms of the evolution of psychotherapy and effect sizes around which of the specific elements of these treatments make a difference, what you see is that there is a large contribution of factors from what's been called non-specific or common factors in psychotherapy. So a strong alliance, empathy by the therapist, a good collaboration, a positive non-conditional affirmation, and in outcomes, with studies that over accumulated totals actually measure not poorly in terms of overall numbers of people studied. And that the specific ingredients, the things that I grew up on, as exposure for anxiety, as behavioral activation for melancholic patients, these seem to, because I'm not sure I totally believe it, but these seem to, look at this, adherence to protocol. I mean, it's kind of frightening that following the protocols seems to contribute so little. But this is some of the ways in which these discussions about modality differences are being swept aside. It doesn't really matter if you have someone doing this or that, as long as they're able to establish an alliance, respond empathically and reflect accurately, to be internally congruent and authentic, and to be able to provide non-conditional positive regard. It kind of takes me back to Carl Rogers' paper in 1957 called Necessary and Sufficient Conditions of Change. Like I said, I don't know that I really believe it, but it is where some of these conversations are going. And there's another place that these conversations are going that also points to flattened modality distinctiveness, which is that if you go into Google Trends and you do a search for the density of search volumes for specific terms, the term Gestalt therapy, the term dialectical behavior therapy, the term psychodynamic therapy, you can see that over the last, I guess it would be 12 years now, from 2004, the search volumes for these terms are essentially the same. Maybe the trend line is heading down a little bit, but essentially no one of these is sort of separating, pulling away from the rest. But when you enter the term mindfulness, or compassion, or even yoga, you can see that this becomes like a footnote. And all of a sudden, people are really seeking out and searching for these other distinctive modalities. And it's not to say it's better or worse, but it is an indicator of a broad band attentional set among people in our society in terms of what they're searching for. And so now maybe the question isn't what's the difference between modalities, but what do modalities share in common with more generic and potentially non-psychotherapeutically sanctioned ways of regulating affect? And so into that conversation come people who may not have been players initially within the psychotherapy world, but people who, through the practice of mindfulness or yoga or aerobic exercise and other modalities, are now providing a window towards affect regulation that shares many features in common, even though their enactments are actually quite different. This is different from this, is different from this, in terms of its expression, but the core metacognitive platform that it's trying to create is probably very, very similar. So, reduced modality distinctiveness is one of the things that I think is going to cause a reconfiguration, whether psychotherapy can absorb these different practices, and we are seeing that even quote, traditional therapists might be incorporating certain elements from ACT, or certain elements from mindfulness, or certain elements from movement practices, or awareness practices in general, and maybe that just makes the psychotherapy cohort a much more expansive and broader one. Or maybe if we really take a close look at what they're doing, they're not really doing psychotherapy per se, because if you look at the kind of practices of awareness in a cold light, they are practices that are able to stand on their own, and they're not necessarily tied to disorder, to insight, and to self-understanding in the same way that psychotherapy is. And so that becomes a question of either integration or some sort of distinctiveness. So the second thing I'd like to talk about is public health significance. And this now is, and you may already know this, NIH is beating the drum about this very, very loudly. I've been funded by NIH for the last 18 years. The message is clear that future studies or trials, randomized controlled trials of the type that were published in 92 or 89 are just no longer fundable. That for them, they believe that the evidence base for psychotherapy is both intact and sufficient for the next phase of their dollars to go to rollout, scale, and dissemination. They're not interested in a comparison of cognitive therapy and a new SSRI versus their combination for OCD that will take 5 years, cost about $2.5 million, and have results 5 or 6 years down the road. They just don't fund that stuff anymore. And there are a lot of talented researchers who, in a sense, have found themselves on the margins, having to either reconfigure or find ways of presenting or joining other teams doing different work. And so here's part of their rationale, and I think that there is some merit to their rationale. They view a number of mental disorders as occurring on a epidemic scale. And so the traditional model of one-to-one therapy treatment delivery is incredibly inadequate to deal with the large number of people who need care or who can who can access care. So if you take a number like 350 million people worldwide who suffer from depression, 60 million in the US, women are more likely to be diagnosed than men, that's about 5% of the world population. And it'll never be fully touched if we rely on in-office therapeutic models of delivery. And that's partly why they're saying there are large needs and large pockets of money for innovations, not to degrade the type of care that's being delivered, but to innovate around platforms for delivering. So this shift from efficacy studies to public health strategies means that the messaging and the content that we might want to deliver face-to-face or individually is going to look different. The strategies involve more of a preventive focus, a promotion focus targeting populations at risk or more generally identified, and then treatment, recovery, and rehabilitation. So public health models of therapy will challenge the individualist approach to an epidemic scale problem. It shifts the focus from of responding from the person to community-based interventions, and it places a premium on early assessment and intervention as key foci. And what you see here is that public health messaging often conveys the same messages we might provide in our contact with people, but does so on a scale that reaches many, many, many more eyeballs. So this is from a campaign in the UK. These are the royals with headbands saying "Heads Together for Mental Health." And in other campaigns here in the US, this person with a smile on their face and a t-shirt that says "I'm not fine, stop hiding your depression," taking up billboards in Massachusetts. Good mental health, it starts with a conversation. Find out how to do that. And then depressionisreal.org, you never say, "It's just cancer, get over it." So why do people say that about depression? So how well have we done with respect to scaling psychotherapy interventions? These data are from a study that I published with some division, a colleague of mine, sampling over about 700 to 800 patients in a variety of psychotherapy studies, and the density of the color represents, or the saturation, if you will, of the color, represents the number of studies or the amount of work done in each of these areas. So you can see that there's basic research on psychotherapy that has a fairly good saturation. A lot of the studies of psychotherapy have been intervention-based to refine and develop treatment, so this would be considered treatment development. Then there continues to be efficacy studies, research in the clinic, research with active controls, but then you start to get very pale colors. Efficacy in community clinic care, effectiveness studies of psychotherapy, implementation and dissemination within health systems. Very, very few studies of these, and so what you see is a concentration of focus on efficacy and then very little rollout into systems. And so that's a problem and also an opportunity for expansion. It's probably a little bit easier in Canada in some ways, and certainly in some jurisdictions like the UK, where they have a centralized health system, and the national health system takes its guidance from the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, which is a sort of Cochrane review on steroids, and reviews different modalities, looks at meta-analytic data, and then recommends to the NHS which of these treatments should be funded. And so they're able to do that across the country because they have that centralized infrastructure. In the US, it's different. You could get some of that if you can partner with a large HMO like Kaiser Permanente, because they have multiple sites and they cover lives in the millions. In Canada, it might be a little bit different. But that is the locus where activity for dissemination and implementation will have to take place. There are so many interventions and treatments that have been developed that may show efficacy in treating specific problems that fall off what we call the implementation cliff. They're developed in an academic context. They may show very promising data, but the individual who is supporting or promoting them rarely manages to get them accepted beyond like their local area code. And so that's really not very efficient. Is moved to other methods like digital health to help wide-scale dissemination. So here, this is the UPMC website, Benoit's alma mater, and what they've done is they've purchased access to an Australian cognitive therapy mental health website called Beating the Blues. They've rebranded it Beating the Blues US, and it's offered under their palette of healthcare for patients with depression. And so they're giving it tremendous credibility. Instead of saying to someone, well, if you want to find an online therapy, you can search for it. Here's a URL. It'll tell you what to do. They're instead offering it as part of their care pathway. So you can get care here this way, you can get care here this way, and also there's this that we also offer. So it's seen as integrated and it's not just sort of patchwork. The other thing that's happening that's important to know is that there's money flowing into digital mental health. There's this company called Big Health that's received, I think, about $18 million from angel investors to develop online health and mental health applications. Their first online program is called Sleepio, and it's essentially an online treatment for insomnia. They've partnered with Boots Pharmacy in the UK to make it available so that you can go into Boots and buy, I guess, a piece of paper or a pamphlet that gives you the URL. Boots distributes it, Boots has it on display, probably near their pharmacy, and Boots has many, 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 many stores where people are going to be seeing Sleepio if Sleepio isn't coming up on their search engines when someone is typing in, how do I cure my insomnia? So this is a trend that's probably going to continue if there is investment, if there is interest in this way. How does psychotherapy position itself so that it can be a player as well? And so one of the examples of Mood Gym, which is very similar to Beat the Blues US, just to show you that these types of websites work through initially providing an assessment of where people find themselves, both in terms of symptom level and other features. If it's a cognitive therapy program, they might focus on relationships between thoughts and feelings. And there's always a disclaimer that these programs are intended to be educational in nature and not therapy providers online because of the obvious liabilities. And then they have a number of different modules related to thoughts, relationships, the thinker, and these different elements that they address. There's also online psychodynamic psychotherapy. This is a study from the Netherlands in which people used David Malan's brief therapy model with this triangulation of elements related to defenses, feelings, and anxiety, and then some transposition of that onto the therapist, current persons, and past persons. And it involves 8 self-help modules over 10 weeks. There is therapist support, but it's only provided via text and email. And it's only once a week, and it specifically answers questions related to these domains. It doesn't delve into an additional therapy module. And as you can see here, some of the data from decreases in PHQ-9 scores, a little bit more impressive than the GAD-7 scores, but still able to provide some measure of symptom relief through this low-cost, high-access, and also high-fidelity platform, because there is no variation in therapist competence. You're getting really the same material over time, and that's considered to be a positive. Now, all of the drivers towards online treatments, the funding environment, the potential of it being developed in innovative ways through this infusion of venture capital cash is good, but we also have to bear in mind what the data say. And so one of the Cochrane reviews of therapist-supported internet cognitive therapy for anxiety disorders in adults says that the websites do pretty well, and this is the frightening part,
ICBT with therapist support may not differ in effectiveness as compared to face-to-face CBT. So that's the disruptive message. Now, it's true that the studies are very few, that they were not necessarily the best quality, but this is the way in which psychotherapy may be disrupted if people start to take that on as a truism, which it may or may not be. It's also interesting that the same factors that I showed you in the flattening of psychotherapy, the common factors, are not as important in the online treatments. So what you can see here is this is the working alliance inventory, which is considered to be a rock-solid measure of therapeutic alliance. And so inside this online therapy, the total score of the WAI, the task, the bond, and the goal elements, they're all positive correlations, but none of them are significant with respect to the outcome changes on the PHQ-9. So, and I guess it makes sense. There's no real therapist to engage with to refine and to establish these different elements. There's a program. There's maybe the kind of beneficence of the institution providing you with the program. But these programs may be working through different mechanisms that we've been, than those that we've been used to considering. Now, all is not lost because, as you can see, the effect sizes for online therapies actually increase with the more human contact that you provide. So you can have a standalone website that is just online, massively efficient, massively cost-effective, massively accessible, but the effect sizes are relatively modest. You could have that same website and add a phone element where you use an IVR technology to provide people with pre-programmed reminders of, did you fill out your activity scheduling today? Did you perform the one pleasurable activity for yourself? Or did you have a chance to do something nice for yourself today? You could have that same support provided by a therapist who may just call in and ask how you're doing. Or you can flip it and have therapy that is augmented by an online portal. And all of these increase the effect size. What they do, though, is they strip it of its main rationale, which is low cost, because as you add these elements, you're adding cost and therapist time. And you're also adding access. You're restricting access because you have to then have, if a lot of people are accessing the website, you've got to have a lot of therapists on call, even if they're just communicating with patients via SMS. And by way of trying to bring some sort of reasonable summary into this, I think it's important to recognize that the web is good for some things, but it's not good for everything. And so web-based digital mental health is very good for conveying content. It's right there and it's very available. It's also good for self-guided learning, where people can work through stepped, coherent modules. They can even be prevented from unlocking successive modules before they finished initial modules so that they have a kind of platform for new knowledge. And as anyone who has teenagers who like to play video games, or if you've dabbled in that yourself, they can be very immersive, like hours on end in the basement, immersive. But there are some things that traditional therapy delivery formats do and have and provide that you really can't get on the web. Web is not very good for dyadic and relational exchanges, both establishing and using that as a motor for change. And I think we saw that in the previous slide, where you looked at the therapeutic alliance for an online therapy, and it turned out that it was not really a large driver of change through the correlations. Web-based experiences are often not experiential, although this may change with the new reductions in broadband for virtual reality, where people are able to create worlds for themselves for certain kinds of applications through VR that may have therapeutic potential. But right now, if you look at Beating the Blues US or other kinds of places, there's not a lot of dyadic relational, there's not a lot of experiential. Traditional formats are also a place where you can provide content, where it can be self-guided, where it's immersive, and also there can be group facilitation and the unique learning that comes from groups that may not be available on the web. And the second to last thing I'd like to consider is another trend, which is the dilution of experience and expertise. How many of you have heard of Khan Academy and Wealth Simple? So these are essentially approaches through the digital age that have disrupted knowledge hierarchies. It used to be that the courses, so Khan Academy is essentially an online university that provides free of charge coursework for all kinds of topics, but mainly math and science courses that are preparatory for taking different types of exams like the SATs in the UK, the MCAT, and other structured intelligence and competence testing. So Khan Academy has just put all of this online, and all of the counselors and the advisors and the Princeton Review people are very upset because this is their core business. And now you can go onto Khan Academy and take the same content with very good instructors walking you through it. That's been enabled by this kind of disruptive capacity and video access and broadband. Wealth Simple has disrupted the field of investing, whereas in the past you would have to speak to a stockbroker or a financial analyst or someone who would be the intermediary between you and the stock market. Wealth Simple uses algorithms and essentially robotic notifications to construct a basket of funds for you, which then tracks metrics on the market and keeps your funds intact or maybe makes a small change to enable it to track this exchange-traded fund index. And their results, by tracking that index, are actually more consistent than brokers or analysts who are telling you to buy or to sell, to come into the market, to stay out of the market. It sort of trumps that expertise. And it does it for a fraction of the management costs that you would be paying if you were using a financial advisor or a stockbroker. Uber is another example where monopolized knowledge has been disrupted through the ability of digital tracking and geolocating and all kinds of other aggregating that happens really well on the web. Well, it turns out psychotherapy is also a knowledge hierarchy and is possible, and it's possible that it too can be disrupted, because if you look at psychotherapy, the early models for sure had expertise in the hands of the few, whether it was interpretation, meta-level observation, other sorts of things, which were then provided to the many to promote insight, change, symptom relief. And these are the kinds of configurations that can be disrupted and are being disrupted in some ways. They're being disrupted in ways that I think 30 years ago would have been inconceivable. So WebMD, for example, will provide diagnostic criteria for the kinds of diagnoses that were often, that would often require a little bit more of a refined clinical assessment to determine, to find out, to engage in differentials around other possible diagnoses. You can find this on the web. It's available right now if you're looking for it. There are support groups for individuals on the web which provide the kind of continuity and validation that were often only provided through therapists caring enough to continue to see difficult patients. And so if you look here, you've got, and people self-identify their diagnoses, anxiety, but BPD, depression, bipolar disorder, BPD. I mean, and the things that people write, I'm crying as a direct result of several emotions. I'm opening up to a friend about my 3-year abusive relationship, which I've only recently even realized was abusive. And this friend is the first I've been comfortable enough to open up since then. I've been angry all day. Now I feel drained. So It used to be that there was really no place for these kinds of transactions to occur. They were occurring online. There may be some benefit for them. At minimum, it gives people a chance to create identities around these emotional states. But it is, I think, hiving off an important function that therapists used to provide for patients. The top 9 sellers on Amazon's mental health book list are how-to manuals to look after yourself without necessarily needing to reach for therapists, or in a direct-to-consumer approach that mimics what drug companies have been doing, to take this manual to your therapist and say, can we enact this? I know that you come from a different tradition. Can you help me with this? And so that's a different conversation with a different driver. And finally, there are people who are actively replacing what psychotherapists do by moving into that space through a different rationale. So I imagine some of you know about this, that there are philosophers who are working to counsel people with emotional difficulties, or what they call dissatisfactions in life, by drawing on the wisdom of the ages and the perennial knowledge of the philosophers to have them provide an answer to people for how to live meaningful lives. And these might be people for whom therapy or pharmacotherapy maybe has failed, who are seeking answers, but they are encountering people who used to be more of the province of psychotherapists. I think it's kind of crazy, but it's out there. I mean, Plato, not Prozac. And although they do have many disclaimers, practice areas and boundaries, traditional and philosophical practice about us, it's not therapy. Inevitably, the people that are coming here are not going to be coming for a discussion of the differences between Heidegger and Nietzsche. They're coming because they want a philosopher or someone who studied philosophy to help them delve into some of these issues, and they may or may not be prepared for what is going to come back at them. So these are trends, these are pressures. I guess if we were in business school, we'd say they're opportunities, turning potentially negative forces and using them in a kind of a Aikido-like gesture to our advantage. But we really need to start to think about how that's going to happen, how that works. And also, I think we need to remind ourselves of the perennial value inside psychotherapy that cannot be provided through other means, and that can be retained. And so there are more than a few glimmerings of what those elements are, at least in my mind, and I'm sure you have your own ideas about what those might be. The first is that most of the disorders that we treat are chronic and recurrent. They are not single episode affairs, and so the idea of sequencing and putting into place strategies for different phases of the disorder is becoming increasingly accepted. And those strategies may often not resemble each other. They may be pharmacotherapy strategies to deal with acute phase presentations. They may be psychotherapy strategies to maintain and to extend remission. And the other piece of it is that just as in physical or internal medicine, a number of disorders have at their core the capacity for being triggered through behavioral acts of dysregulation to look after ensuring that people are exercising, eating healthy, monitoring their blood glucose, managing a chronic and recurrent illness. What's really interesting to me, though, is the possibility that as the illness that's being managed becomes more complex and more comorbid, that sequencing seems to be a very effective strategy, even with interventions that are quite distinct from each other. So there's some data on DBS sequenced with cognitive therapy, where you can see that at the end of DBS and the addition of cognitive therapy helped to potentially bring down the spike in scores. We submitted a grant to CHR in the last competition, which wasn't funded, but we'll attribute that to the chaotic nature of CHR rather than to our own intelligence, to sequence people who have had RTMS and adding MBCT for those people who've been able to move into remission to help them stay well because of the evidence that rTMS and MBCT neuroplastic changes may be impacting the same neural regions. That's a really exciting partnership that can't really be taken apart for two modalities working if they're having similar effects on important brain regions. And the notion of sequencing and between psychotherapy and pharmacotherapy, this is an article that came out this year in the American Journal, is also showing a fairly robust effect within this meta-analysis as a strategy that deserves to be considered. So how can we advocate for these strategies that write in psychotherapy into the protocols and then provide it with a very important platform for its ongoing effectiveness? So one of the things that we've done, I think, is canvass a number of different trends. These trends have spoken about methods of either conveying or disseminating psychotherapy principles, but underneath that we have to recognize that psychotherapy isn't really applied in a manner to patients that are homogeneous. Patients do vary in terms of their prognoses, and the first episode folks with mild to moderate severity, those with comorbid diagnoses that are chronic, those that then have adverse childhood events and unresolved trauma might be likely to benefit to some of these approaches that involve distributed learning and remote access technologies. But as you move up the severity axis, you're going to require considerable expertise. That's the thing that can never really be learned out of the system. That needs to be retained in the system, because it's only that expertise that will allow this kind of work to be bolstered enough for outcomes to be meaningful and sustained. And so that's really the talk that I wanted to give about not the future of psychotherapy, but perhaps psychotherapy in the future, and to leave you with these points that, from my point of view, that there's no longer a battle between dominant etiological models the way there was, say, 30 or so years ago, that within a public health and public funding environment, the significance and rollout and scale of psychotherapy trumps remaining efficacy concerns, that there is great promise in sequencing and positioning of psychotherapy in the treatment pathway, and the perennial focus on relational and contextual concerns can address more complex disorders and will likely remain an exclusive domain of focus. Thanks very much.